Hi, Mr. Weaver. This is Tyler Barron here from our engineering class, here for our week 2, week 3 summary through our first screencast of this semester. I know a lot of the other students had the first 8 weeks of the course where they did it too, but since I was not in that, this would be my first screencast one aside from last semester back in the fall. So to kick things off, let's go ahead and get started with week 2. Had a few different the resources. The Internet of Things is the first thing we worked on. um, I think as you'll see in my comment down here, we can look for that real quick. It's gonna be right here. We go. I wanted to find examples of the Internet of Things being used in education, and the main reason I wanted to do this was because of how much more the internet's being used by all facets of different majors and different careers and different paths, that having kids and young adults learn how to use the internet for these types of things can better prepare them for those careers, now that it's so much more implemented. And so I used this from builtin.com, that they gave examples and everything of it being used, and I found it a super interesting read. If you want to give that a read yourself, or recommend it to anybody else, that was amazing. Um, I read through a couple of my classmates, and they were also super cool. Um, Gyros was one I liked that I really found interesting and kind of applied to a lot of the current things. Um, Obviously, with things being more only on the internet or more accessible on the internet, that we do have to watch out for security and cyber attacks, and being relevant to what happened to us recently, with the shutdown for an extra week for spring break because of that cyber attack. And so that was just an example of how that would be relevant towards our day-to-day lives now. So next, we did, let's see, the 3D displays. You gave the comment that about we started out with red and green glasses, and now we're all the way to the point where we're using VR to play games, augmented reality, and all that stuff. And so what I wanted to talk about was kind of the difference between virtual reality and augmented reality. I had heard the two different terms, and honestly, I kind of just assumed they were the same thing. After doing a little bit more research, I found out that virtual reality is a completely simulated scenario. So it puts you in a completely new situation, as opposed to the augmented reality, which takes something that you're actually seeing, or that is reality, and it just augments it, or it changes it, or enhances it in some way, that makes it slightly virtual, but not the same as completely virtual, which is what I had been familiar with. So that was an interesting thing to find out. I didn't really realize that. Um, I do think that there's a lot of possibility for augmented reality, for specifically for the military. Um, I think that developing not necessarily weapons, but just products that make our military safer. Um, that way, less people have to sacrifice their lives. I think that's a huge thing, and I think augmented reality can help with that, whether that be through headsets that show them different things and features that allow them to stay safer, or whether that allows them to just have more realistic training. Both of those are possibilities that augmented reality can give to the people, specifically in the military. Um, Next, I didn't have much time to do the actual 3D design, as I've been in the ER. I've been suffering, or I was suffering from a slight illness. I had my broken hand, and so I've obviously been a little preoccupied with a couple medical things, and so I haven't been quite able to finish up the 3D design. Being familiar with SolidWorks and having my certificate in SolidWorks, that's what I expect to use for that. I just haven't quite completed that yet. The other thing I did in towards the end of week 2, beginning of week 3 a little bit, was start to create a team and get a team together for this semester. Is That's what you were hoping for us to do, is get in teams of 3 ideally, and so that's what I kind of started in week 2, and I'll go over that a little bit in week 3 when we move over to that segment. Our discussion for week 2, computer models. So I think this brought up a really good point, and you brought up a really good discussion. And I think one of the first things that I noticed that I found super interesting was how you mentioned how global cooling and global warming and now global climate change, how the models that came out at those times, they've never been right. And I hadn't really ever thought about that. I kind of just skipped over my thought process whenever I was thinking about these things. And I've always thought that, not that climate change isn't real, but that both sides of politics nowadays use climate change as an argument when there's a middle ground that doesn't necessarily favor one side or the other. And I think your discussion kind of helped bring that out. And so that's kind of what I was talking about in this, as well as in week 3's discussion that we went over, where we looked at the Ray versus Greta, because I found that super interesting. We'll go over that soon here as well. And so here I was replying to a couple people where they were talking about, specifically Jaro was talking about computer models aren't perfect yet, and so I was agreeing with that. However, I don't know if it is possible to make a perfect computer model, and the reason being is that humans are flawed, and so I'm not entirely sure that it's possible for a flawed being to create a perfect model or a perfect anything, to be fair. I mean, I think perfect is kind of relative, um, in a sense, because what necessarily defines something as perfect in math, it's not relative because it's 100% accuracy for what 2 plus 2 equals or something like that, and that's not relative, but not everything is like that, and so it can be difficult to determine what is a perfect computer model when we don't have that intelligence. So I found that a super interesting discussion. Overall, week 2, pretty busy week compared to week 3, because week 3 is when I spent most of my time dealing with the medical thing. Week 2 was mainly just a broken hand, and I was just a little bit slower to do some things. Most of it I got done, like I said, other than that 3D design thing. Last thing we can talk about is the AI, so artificial intelligence. And what I talked about in mine was how I found a source that went over 3 specific or 3 individual types of AI. And it was weak AI, strong AI, and super AI. And so for each one, I just discussed how some of them have disadvantages and advantages, but none of them are necessarily good or bad without context. It all depends on what they are. So, I mean, a super AI on its own is amazing. I mean, it's not developed yet, but if it ever were, that's it would be able to do basically anything. The issue is that you give it context and it could possibly um, decide on its own that humans are a flaw and shouldn't exist. And so that would be something that would make it bad, or on the opposite, would make it good by developing better technologies for us. But on its own, it's not necessarily a good or bad thing. And so that was pretty much it for week 2. All right, on to week 3 we go, or module 3, whichever you prefer, doesn't really matter. You went over the neat resource for screencasting, where we all discussed like what systems we used. I mentioned originally using Screencast-O-Matic, but I saw a couple students talk about OBS, and so I said I was going to do some research into that, and that's actually what I ended up switching to. We went over the bumper music, and I learned some about that, and in the transition as well as the intro, you probably heard that playing. Talking and testing ain't learning. I found this one super interesting, where you go over the Traxaline and then the turbo inaccubulator discussion. And this was the video, and the other one was the just short comments with the quiz. I found this one super cool, and I think it really describes what's going on in today's education. I think it's outdated in the sense that in the 18 and 1900s, the point of school was memorization, and that way you learned how to work in a factory, and that's not necessarily the goal of school anymore, or it shouldn't be at least. But yet we still teach it like it is. Sitting down and reading a paper without any context doesn't help you learn. And what I mentioned was how it's difficult to learn, and what it would be a better way to teach would be to give somebody a topic or a subject or something about a related conversation, obviously about the related class, but to then have them go and research that topic on their own and to have them learn on their own, because that's a better motivator and a better and more efficient way to learn and actually absorb the information versus just reading something without context and memorizing it. And one thing I really liked was one student I replied to mentioned how you might be able to pass and answer the questions on that quiz without actually knowing the answers or knowing why they're the right answers. And I found that that was a point that I hadn't really thought of. That makes a lot of sense to me. Um, and it's just another way of looking at it that, yeah, you can get 100 out of 100 on a test, but you don't necessarily know why those answers are right. You just looked at your study material and you memorized that it's right. That doesn't help you in a career. That your career is not going to be based off can you pass a standardized test. That's just not how it works. And so it was Patricia here who brought up that point. I really liked that, and I hadn't thought about that. And so I replied to her, letting her know about that. What else in week 3? Let's see. Earth Day. This is where we also talked about our views on the entire issue of climate change, and where I mentioned the Greta versus Roy. Um, and I I did a decent amount of thinking about this question, because I think it is a little bit complicated of a scenario, and it's not necessarily a right answer. And I think the big thing for me is that the question isn't whether or not climate change exists. Climate change exists, and that's a given. I think the real question is, do humans have an effect on climate change? And if so, how much of an effect? And does that effect matter? And I think those are kind of the questions that we're leaning towards and that are really being asked when it comes to the climate change issue. And on that, I think again, it really there are answers, but I don't think we necessarily know enough um, to say one is right over another. And I think the only thing we can say is that the discussion of climate change has become political, and it shouldn't be. Um, our climate should not be something that is being twisted in words to make it sound either worse or non existent. It should be given as what's happening, what we think will happen, why we think it'll happen, and what we should do. And that's it. Instead of the left or Democrat or whatever you want to call it, pretending like in 20 years we're all going to die because of it, and the right or the Republicans or whatever you want to call that, pretending like it doesn't exist at all, because neither of those is correct, and neither of those are going to help anybody. And so I think it really comes down to everybody coming together and meeting in the middle and deciding like, okay, yeah, we get it. Not every like nobody's going to die from this. Nobody's going to drown from the sea levels raising a couple inches or a foot or whatever. But it would definitely just change our habitat and change what we have to do. But it's not necessarily a crisis in the sense that a volcano going off is a crisis, if you know what I mean. And so I think that's kind of what I tried to iterate through my comment on the Earth Day section. Lastly, competencies. That was another one I haven't quite got to. I've got the Google Doc created. I'm still just kind of copying over the stuff from the syllabus and kind of just slowly working my way through the answer to answering that stuff. And then lastly is the Module 3 summary, and that's what I'm doing right now. So the only other thing for Module 3 was finishing up the teams, and so I was able to do that. I reached out to Yarden first, and Yarden mentioned he didn't have a team yet, so I asked him if he wanted to join up, and so we went ahead and created our team. And then I reached out to a couple classmates, and Carson was the first one I heard back from, and so he went ahead and joined our team as well. And so we've gone ahead and had our team decided on for this semester. So it's going to be myself, Tyler, and then it's going to be Yarden and Carson, and so that's our team of three for any of the projects that we've got working on. So regarding that, I've discussed the 3D design thing with them from week 2, just to kind of get a sense of what they're doing and what objects they do. That way we don't all do the same objects, like you said. And then I've talked to them about the competencies as well. So we're all just sharing information to see kind of where we're all at and make sure none of us are like falling too far behind or anything like that. So it's definitely been a good thing to go ahead and get that team decided on just out of the gate. That way we know what's up and what's going on. That way we can finish the semester on top and do what we need to do and to get done. And um, yeah, other than that, I think that's pretty much it for Module 3 and Module 2 summary. Um, I know we're getting into Module 4 next. I know you've got quite a few things going on, and so you won't necessarily have that posted immediately. I'm looking forward to our next content. In the meantime, I'm going to work on that 3D design and that competencies a little bit more, um, and go from there. And hopefully we'll talk soon or get an update soon on what's next. And that's about it. So, all right, I'll see you later.